right.
Hello.
Hi, Steve.
Hey, Sam. Hey, do you have headphones so I don't bleed into your side of the conversation here?
Nobody said anything about headphones. Let's see what I got.
Okay, sorry. Somebody should have said earbuds, please.
Let me see if these will work. I don't tend to use them, so.
And your video has gone away, but I assume you're going to turn that back on after you, once you're ready to go.
All right. Can you hear me?
I hear you. Do you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, well, that's a good thing.
Well, you're cutting in and out. Oh, there you are.
I just did something to make it noisy for a moment. But I can't see you now.
Well, oh, look,
You turned off your video.
Start my video.
There we go.
Hi.
Hi.
Should I start recording this?
Yes. Oh my God. Yes, please do.
Okay.
Please start recording.
Yep. Now we're recording.
And we are live now. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining Living on Earth's latest virtual Goodreads on Earth event. I'm Steve Curwood, the host of Living on Earth and executive producer. We are a nationally syndicated public radio program and podcast that covers the latest news in climate change, ecology, and human health. And today, we welcome physician Sam Myers, and he's co-editor of the new book, Planetary Health, Protecting Nature to Protect Ourselves. Let me see. Oh, I think we might have a copy here. So this is what it looks like. And shameless promotion, you're allowed to rush out after this session to buy one if you want. This is, Sam himself is a physician. He co-edited with Howard Frumkin this book. It's called Planetary Health, Protecting Nature to Protect Ourselves. Sam directs the Planetary Health Alliance and is a principal research scientist at the Harvard T.H. School of Public Health, and he studies the intersection of environmental change and human health. Sam, welcome to Living on Earth.
It's such a pleasure to be here with you, Steve. Thank you.
Our pleasure. So, Sam, the book we're talking about here is, well, frankly, it's a textbook, and we rarely talk to people about textbooks. But in this case, it's named Planetary Health. This is the name of a brand new field of study and consideration that you've been involved with since the very beginning. So please tell me, what is planetary health and how did you get involved in this field?
Yeah, well, so you're right. Planetary health is it's a very new, very interdisciplinary field that I think has really emerged out of this moment that we globally find ourselves in. And it's a field that's focused on understanding the human health implications of our own disruption and transformation of most of our planet's natural systems. So it's about how global environmental changes actually come back to threaten our own health and well-being.
And I suppose if biologist E.O. Wilson were with us at this moment, he'd say, well, what do you expect? We all evolved from this particular ecosystem. And you would say?
Yeah, I would say that we've evolved over 4 million years in close conjunction with a set of actually relatively stable biophysical conditions, and that now we are changing those biophysical conditions really across the board at the fastest rates in the history of our species. And so it isn't that surprising that those biophysical changes are translating into some pretty significant threats for human health across just about every dimension of health.
A bit of an understatement, Sam, I would say, huh? I mean, this is such a really big deal. So I know when you wrote this book, the pandemic hadn't shown its face. I just did something strange here with the circuit. I hope I have not done something wrong with the circuit. Do you hear me?
I hear you.
Do you see me?
I see you.
Okay. I will ask our tech people to restore the screen for me because I don't see it at this moment. But hey, we'll keep talking. Um, um, so, um, so as I was about to say before the system became a little strange, you wrote this book before the pandemic, and no one could have imagined that it was just around the corner. But today, what does this coronavirus, this COVID-19 pandemic, say about the importance of studying planetary health?
Well, I think it says a lot, Steve. And it's not just the COVID pandemic. I mean, I think we'd be remiss not to acknowledge that we're speaking to each other on a night when 5 million acres of the West Coast has burned, where the size of the fires is producing a plume of smoke that when I just went for a walk this evening in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it was darkening the skies 3,000 miles away, while yet another big hurricane is making landfall as we speak in Louisiana, and where moving people to safety is significantly complicated by a global infectious disease pandemic. And each one of those disasters has significant human contributions. And so, in many ways, the COVID pandemic, as you say, it got started after we had written the book, and we ended up writing an afterword to sort of try to frame it as a planetary health challenge. But it has a lot to teach us because, first of all, it teaches us that messing with nature is dangerous, right? So the pandemic
Exactly.
itself comes out of interactions with wildlife. And we know that something like 3/4 of emerging infectious diseases in the last 50 years have come from wildlife populations. So, incursions into wildlife habitat and logging and mining and agricultural incursions all open up our exposure to these kinds of viruses. And these live animal markets where we're bringing exotic species into close proximity with each other also tends to lead to increased risk of this kind of transmission. And so the origins of the pandemic have to do with humans messing around with natural systems. But in a lot of ways, I think, some of the hopeful parts, and I hope that this book fundamentally is a hopeful book, also are reflected in the pandemic. And obviously, it's been a complete, disaster in terms of loss of lives and livelihoods around the world. But I would say that it's taught us a few things. One is that we're capable on an extraordinarily short time scale of sort of weeks to months of completely changing behavior across almost all the people across almost all of the planet. And so this massive scale collective behavior change is something we've never seen before in the history of our species. And it's encouraging because in some ways it's that kind of large scale behavior change that we need to address many of the planetary health challenges we face. It's also taught
Isn't
us,
that
go ahead,
I
Steve.
I was just going to say, isn't that exciting? It was just amazing that in the course of just these few months, that so many things have changed. There's some very sad things, obviously, but just mobilizing our species now, because this thing doesn't really pay that much attention to political borders. It's
I,
just amazing to see.
I agree. I agree. I think it is, and I think we've also learned that nature is a solace. If you look at what people are doing as the world has shut down, they're going out to parks and areas of open space to recreate, and they're finding significant solace in those places. We're learning that nature regenerates very, very quickly, which is actually hopeful that suddenly air quality starts to improve and animals move back into habitats and water quality gets better. And so there's this sense of potential for regeneration, which I think is hopeful. we've learned that science matters, and much to our detriment, but I think that's actually a very important theme in planetary health, that we actually need to understand how changing our natural systems affects health. And I guess the last thing I would say is that I also think we have this extraordinary opportunity associated with the pandemic, which in all of these sort of economic stimulus packages and foreign assistance packages that are going to spend trillions of dollars of our tax money, there's the opportunity to build a much more hopeful future and get us on a different trajectory. So I do think there are lots of ways in which the moment we find ourselves in is relevant.
So now let's zoom in for a moment to one of the sections of this book. And I have to say, you have many, many fascinating, interesting sections. And it's a shame that we don't have 5 or 6 hours to go through everything that you have in this. But let's look at one section. You have a chapter on mental health on a changing planet. For a lot of people, this isn't such an obvious topic, but please tell us why you and Howard Frumkin thought this was important to include.
Yeah, I think that mental health is one of the really understudied and underemphasized, but maybe one of the most important areas where accelerating environmental change is threatening our health. And there's a very large, sort of well-established body of evidence around the mental health effects of big disasters. We know that these fires across the West Coast are going to have an enormous mental health toll. We know that the big hurricanes have huge sort of mental health effects in terms of depression, anxiety, job loss, suicidality. And we know that those impacts are actually very robust and long lasting. So if you go back to Katrina victims 10 years, 15 years later, you're still seeing mental health effects in those populations. But there's this whole realm of much more subtle mental health effects that people are starting to call eco-anxiety or ecological grief. And it sort of begs the question, what is the burden that we carry with us of knowing that our own actions collectively are sort of systematically dismantling natural systems? What's the mental health burden people experienced last week when we learned that about 2/3 of the mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes that used to inhabit the planet have been pushed off the planet by our own activities? And Glenn Albrecht, who's a philosopher in Australia, talks about this term solastalgia, which is like the anxiety and grief associated with the loss of cherished places. And we've started to wonder whether there isn't almost an anticipatory solastalgia. What does it mean to anticipate that the places that we love are changing and that maybe our children or our grandchildren won't see those places, or at least not in the state that we've known them? And so there's a whole area of research now starting to try to understand what those burdens are that may be almost invisible, but could still be very significant.
So, Doctor, I know you're very early in this process, but what treatments have you come across that are going to help with this intense pressure on our mental health?
Yeah, so Steve, the arc of the sort of narrative of this book is really to start with, why is it that just in the last sort of 50 years, the scale of the human sort of ecological footprint, the size that we have on this planet, has ballooned so much? And what are the ecological drivers? How are we changing most of the environmental conditions? And it's not just climate change, it's sort of everything change. So looking at that and understanding how are we transforming nature. The next section is really about going through every dimension of health and understanding what are the health effects. And so that's, as you say, that's the diagnosis side. What's the problem? And the problem is that most dimensions of human health are being threatened in a significant way now by our transformation of nature. But the whole second half of the book is what you just asked me about, which is the treatment side. So what do we do about the predicament that we're in? And it's interesting. I mean, when we set out, we sort of laid out the different sort of major dimensions of human activity, and we wanted to see what we know about solutions. And so we talk about economics, about business, about the chemical manufacturing industry and green chemistry, about the food system, about the built environment, about energy and the need for transitioning to a zero carbon energy economy. And one of the things that I found so striking is, first of all, it's extraordinarily rich terrain. So there are tons of things that we can do and that we know how to do already across every one of those domains. Ultimately, what I sort of came to realize is that I was, at least for myself, asking almost the wrong question, which is, can we get ourselves out of this mess? And that's not the question, because we can get ourselves out of this mess. The solutions are right there for the taking across every domain. The real question is, do we have the will? Do we have the political will? Do we have the collective sort of social will to embrace those solutions? And so our last chapter is really about this kind of aspirational vision of what the world could look like if we get this right. But really, you name a sector and there's just an enormous sort of accelerating list of solutions across every domain for how we live on the planet, and a lot that we can do to get ourselves on a different trajectory.
So on the mental health question, how fair is it to say that turning away from, I don't know what the equivalent of mass suicide is, turning away from that very pessimistic view, letting things just simply continue to deteriorate and grasping hope, how fair is that to say that that's really, among other things, a solution to the mental health stresses that our rapid change have brought on us?
No, it's a fantastic point, and we talk about that very specifically in the mental health chapter, is that collective action, movement building, social organizing, coming together to take action is not only necessary, it's also therapeutic. I think it's possible to be a teeny bit glib about that. And I think it's important to also acknowledge that this ecological grief that I'm talking about is very real, and that allowing ourselves to experience that and acknowledge it is not a bad thing. Chris Jordan, who is a producer and an artist and did this amazing film Albatross about the challenge of plastics in our oceans, talks about how grief is the other side of love. And I think that's true. I think that if we love something and it's in distress, then we grieve for it. And so I think the first step is to acknowledge that things are really challenging, and that it's extraordinary that almost every single person in this country right now, tonight, as we speak, is experiencing in some form or another some kind of ecological associated threat. But then we need to move from acknowledging the grief to coming together to take collective action. And I think that's why some of the movement building that's been going on over the last couple of years is so exciting, whether we're talking about, the climate strike movement and Greta Thunberg, or we're talking about the Extinction Rebellion, or we're talking about the birth strike movement, or, any number of other kinds of social movements that not only are they the only way to address big power problems where people actually have to hold governments and industries accountable to take the right actions, but they also bring us together, which is itself a therapy, I think, against the kind of ecological despair that I'm talking about.
Sam, let's talk about another section of your book. And this, of course, actually, there are a couple of sections on disease, which is more, very relevant today. We already talked about COVID-19, but in one section, you detail infectious diseases. I'm thinking of malaria, along with non-infectious diseases, cancer, diabetes, heart disease. Tell us, please, about the correlation between environmental change and the risk of disease.
Well, it's a huge topic. As I said, it's really kind of the first half of our book. And, it's people tend to gravitate in their heads toward infectious diseases. We think about the hot zone. We obviously are all thinking about COVID now. We think about Ebola, and certainly all kinds of biophysical change is associated with big changes in infectious disease exposures. But in a lot of ways, it's the non-infectious diseases that are likely to drive the largest global burdens of disease. And so, yeah, for example, the non-communicable diseases, a big report came out a couple of years ago about global pollution of air, water, and soil, showing that about 9 million excess deaths a year are attributable to pollution. And those deaths are non-communicable diseases. They're heart disease, stroke, respiratory disease, some kinds of cancers, the mental health effects that we just talked about. We worry about displacement. Many parts of the world are essentially becoming, at least temporarily, uninhabitable for parts of the year. And all of those people need to move somewhere, often to places where they're not welcome. And so you get this cycle of displacement and potentially conflict. And so and then there's this huge category of nutritional diseases, which is where I do a lot of my own research, where we're seeing biophysical changes associated with changes not only in the quantity of food that we can produce, but also even the quality of foods that we produce, with big nutritional consequences for populations around the world. And so, as you start to sort of unpack this question of how changing our environmental conditions will affect our health, it gets more and more and more complicated, and the effects get more extensive. And of course, all of those effects are getting more severe as the biophysical changes get more severe.
Yeah, Sam, let's drill down, in fact, on some of the research that you did, that you're doing on nutrition. It's now a number of years ago that we first noticed here on Living on Earth, the work that you were doing, showing that as carbon dioxide levels went up, that this was bad news for a number of commodity crops. Or as heat goes up, this is bad news for commodity crops. So talk in some detail about your research here in this area of nutrition, being able to feed. I lose track of how many people we are on the planet. Are we 7 billion? Have we hit 8 yet? During these times, please.
So I wear two hats. I direct the Planetary Health Alliance, and then I'm also a research scientist. And so with my research hat, I'm engaged in a bunch of research projects, and most of which really look at how changing biophysical conditions affect nutritional outcomes around the world. And so one example is the work you were talking about, where with a team of people all over the world, we're looking at this question of how rising carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere might affect the nutritional quality of staple food crops that we depend on for our nutrients. And what we found a while ago was that when you grow crops at carbon dioxide levels that we expect to reach by the middle of this century, they lose a lot of their iron and zinc and protein, really essential nutrients for human health. And so we spent several years after that initial finding then modeling the diet of populations in 152 countries around the world to understand how these nutrient changes would actually alter the total sort of intake of those nutrients for people around the world, and whether it would push them into deficiencies of those nutrients, which are very serious public health problems. And what we found was on the order of 150 to 200 million people would be likely to be pushed into new risk of deficiencies like zinc and protein, as well as the billion or so people who already aren't getting enough of those nutrients in their diets. And so that's just one small example of how, in a way that was almost impossible to anticipate, which is another theme in planetary health, right? These surprises and these unintended consequences. But who would have thought, if we were sitting around 20 years ago having a beer, that adding carbon dioxide would make our food less nutritious? But that's one impact of adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and yet it potentially affects hundreds of millions of people. We also do work on how global declines in pollinators and bees and other insects is affecting health outcomes for people around the world. And we're estimating somewhere around 500,000 deaths a year from just not having enough pollinators to produce the foods that keep us healthy. We've been looking at fisheries and how changes in fisheries in response to ocean warming will affect the intake of critical nutrients, and finding, again, these large vulnerabilities. So these are just examples of ways that all of our collective activities that are transforming our planet's environmental conditions come back to impact our own health, often in ways that are somewhat surprising.
Sam, I want to ask you about some solutions to those issues you just raised. But first, let's just zero in for a moment on the effects of carbon dioxide. I remember that the climate denial folks were saying a number of years ago, hey, more CO2, that puts plants on steroids. They have more of the nutrient that they want. Um, and yet your research shows, no, that makes things more difficult for them. What are the human health effects of not having some of those nutrients that you just mentioned?
Well, first of all, those climate deniers are still saying that, and we're still trying to make it clear that fundamentally they're just essentially lying. I mean, it's quite clear, and there's a very large body of evidence showing that all in all, rising CO2 actually reduces crop yield. So yes, there's this little esoteric CO2 fertilization effect, but it's more than offset by rising temperatures and changes in precipitation and all the other things that come along with climate change. And so it's a little bit disingenuous, I would say. But now I've forgotten what your question was because I got so heated up about that.
By the way, all this CO2 is helping poison ivy.
Yeah, exactly.
Things like that.
And ragweed.
Really weedy plants and ragweed.
Yeah.
Well, what I asked you just to talk a little bit about the nutrients that start to fall out of these plants and the human health effects of that. I mean, how are you in trouble, for example, if you don't get enough zinc?
Yeah, so the way you answer that question is actually by doing zinc repletion studies. And so those studies are done in children where we think there's the most vulnerability to zinc deficiency. And so if you take groups of kids and when this was originally done, you randomly add zinc to the diet and replete the diet with zinc, what you find is that those kids are dying at much lower rates of things like pneumonia, malaria, diarrhea, of infectious diseases. And it makes sense because zinc is an important nutrient in the functioning of the immune system. And so all of the morbidity and mortality that's estimated from zinc deficiency is from increased mortality to infectious diseases. For something like iron, it's actually much more complicated because iron is, a principal constituent for hemoglobin, which is what our red blood cells are 99% full of, and which is necessary for us to move oxygen around to our tissues. And so iron deficiency, reduces work capacity, but it also affects IQ and it increases maternal mortality and infant mortality. So it has this whole series of impacts to be iron deficient. But overall, these are very serious deficiencies that are associated with large global burdens of disease already. And so further increasing those deficiencies is really a big public health problem.
And if I recall correctly, you found that not too much warming or disruption really led to these problems in the nutritional quality.
Yeah, well, just to be clear, it's independent of warming. So this is an additional effect that has nothing to do with the climate itself. It's a direct effect of carbon dioxide on crop nutrients. And so, and it's true that what we were modeling were CO2 levels that, as I say, we expected to see the middle of this century. So this is at 550 parts per million, and we're rapidly headed there now. And so these are not crazy high sort of theoretical levels of carbon dioxide where we're seeing these nutrient changes.
Okay, sorry, I got that wrong. CO2, but not warmer. So what about solutions then? Let's just drill down for a moment on the question of solutions in this food and nutrition area. What things do you want to point to?
Well, I mean, I think there are solutions that we could point to around these specific questions like CO2, but that's really a tiny little piece of the big picture. Big picture is that our food system is probably more responsible for our transformation of the global environment than anything else. We use 40% of the terrestrial land surface for croplands and pasture, about half the accessible fresh water, mostly to irrigate our crops. We're fishing out, 90% of monitored fisheries. So that there's a huge ecological footprint to our food system. And then the flip side is that environmental change is creating these enormous headwinds in producing food right when we need to roughly double food production in order to keep up with demand. And so we have this eye of a needle that we have to thread between destroying the biosphere by expanding agricultural production and still feeding 10 billion people. And that's where we really need to think about solutions. And the answer is that they fall into really three different domains. The first is to think about waste. And so we waste something like 30 or 40% of the food that we produce, both in the wealthy world and in the poor world. And so there's just an enormous amount that can be done in reducing food waste. And it's super exciting because there's a ton that's happening right now to actually achieve that. There are new mobile phone apps that are like Too Good To Go in Europe, which allow consumers to be connected with grocers to prevent food from being thrown out and allow people to actually use it. And there are new storage techniques that are spreading across poorer regions to prevent pests. And so there's a whole lot that's going on around food waste. The second area is dietary change. And so what we eat is a problem. And, globally, particularly in the wealthy world, we need to eat a lot less red meat and a lot more plant-sourced protein. And the good news is, just like so many solutions in planetary health, if we were to do that to protect natural systems, we get this huge health dividend in the process. So it's much better for our own health if we're actually eating a more plant-based diet. And so there's been a lot of work in the last 5 years sort of modeling these global diets and understanding how we could optimize diet. And then the third domain is production. How do we actually produce our food? And the good news in some perverse way is that we're immensely wasteful in the way that we produce food, which means there's a huge amount that we can do in being much more efficient with inputs of land and water and agrochemicals and energy. And we're starting to see that. We're seeing, precision agriculture really taking off, and the use of robotics to be much more efficient in how we use agricultural inputs. We're seeing new things like Impossible Burger or protein fermentation, the production of synthetic milk or eggs that actually has a much, much, much smaller ecological footprint and is presumably considerably healthier for us to consume. We're seeing insect flowers starting to be used even in places like the US and Canada, which are a new source of protein. So there are all of these innovations that are taking place. There also are old tried and true methods from agroecology that are being shown through research to be much more effective, more profitable with much lower ecological footprint. So when you start to look at this whole sort of huge menu of solutions that can be drawn from, and you see similar things across energy systems and urban design, that's what I mean about this sort of rich terrain of solutions.
So we just need the willingness, huh, Sam?
So I really think it's a matter of political will. Yeah.
I mean, I think probably an interesting example is bacon. I think many people see bacon as, really not very healthy. And yet if you put it out, especially around a campfire, it'll disappear in a moment. How do we change?
Well, I think we are changing. And as I said at the beginning, I think that the COVID pandemic has taught us that we're capable of actually changing in profound ways very quickly, which we didn't even know about ourselves. I think we have to start by the diagnosis. We have to start by recognizing that we're in really an extraordinary moment in human history. It's an inflection point. We cannot continue on our current trajectory. Our global house is on fire. And so we have to be motivated by the fact that we can't stay on this course. And then right. I think it's more than policy. I think it's more than what governments can do. I think that ultimately people, and this goes back to your question about mental health, people need to come together to take collective action, to organize, and to hold their governments, accountable, and insist that stimulus packages are spent, towards Green New Deals or, other kinds of investments in infrastructure that's going to take us in the right direction. So I think, some of it is about technological solutions, some of it is about movement building and organizing, some of it is about better governance. And at the end of the day, I think there's a spiritual sort of cultural dimension to this. We need to tell ourselves some different kinds of stories about our relationship to nature. And, underlying all of these sort of ecological and public health crises, there's, I think, a spiritual crisis where we've kind of lost our way and we've lost our sense of connectedness to the natural world. And I think we need to move from stories of sort of exploitation and dominance, which underlies so much of our action, to stories of, regeneration and reciprocity and codependence with natural systems. And so, there's a role for our artists and our spiritual leaders in kind of getting us back on track on that level as well.
Sam, this isn't in your book, but I'm tempted to ask. Back when human beings were in balance with how the planet operates, most of us lived in fairly aboriginal ways. And those cultures, almost all of them, although all the ones that I know about, have fascinating creation stories that really link with nature. That there will be some creature in some tribe. It might be an eagle, it might be a bear, it might be a fish, it might be the raven, for example. We don't, in our modern sort of creation story for our society, we don't really talk about our relationship with the rest of nature. How might that help us start to turn around our system so that in fact we do act in all these exciting, sustainable ways that you've outlined that are certainly possible, but as you say, we don't seem to have the political will yet?
Well, it's a lovely question, Steve, and I think we do need to do that. I've been loving reading Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she actually starts her book out with a creation story from her tribe. And towards the end of the essay, she actually talks about, her creation story has a tree of life and this turtle and this tree of life that creates plenty and this relationship of reciprocity between the people and the natural world. And then she very gently contrasts that with Eden and with being expelled from the garden, and this almost right from the beginning, sort of almost antagonistic relationship. And it's why I say I think we need to tell ourselves new stories. I think that every major faith tradition, including those in Christianity, have stories about stewardship, about the importance of relationship to nature. And I think that we need to weave together what we know from planetary health science with these old traditional stories. And there's an enormous amount of indigenous wisdom, as you say, across most cultures, I think. And we need to weave all of that together to reinforce a new set of stories that we tell ourselves about our place in the world and our relationship to nature, and even what makes us happy. I mean, we've been fed sort of a bill of goods about, what makes us happy. And so there's a kind of a spiritual awakening that I think is called for in this moment, as much as the sort of technological and scientific progress that's also going to carry us forward.
And in fact, in your book, there's a chapter for that on happiness. We've hit the time now that we really should turn to you folks that are out there listening to us have this chat and see what questions you might have. So let me check with my producer, Jay Feinstein, to see what is coming in. So Mark Thorson says, NPR ran a piece a few days ago, headline, "How Big Oil Misled the Public into Believing Plastic Would Be Recycled." The upshot was that none of it is being recycled. We all know that voting is important. What can be done on an individual level to keep plastic out of the oceans, and I would add it's ubiquitous in the environment. It's in our food. It's on mountaintops and at the bottom of the sea. Yes. So, any ideas, Sam?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that plastic in the environment is a huge problem, and I strongly recommend the movie I just mentioned, Albatross, which is really about that problem, but in a just absolutely beautifully done fashion. Um, I think that the answer to your question is probably you can't do very much as an individual, and I think that's actually the answer to a lot of questions about what can I personally do to address these big global problems that you're facing? And there's a way in which sometimes I think, all of us in the sort of progressive side of the democratic or of the political spectrum are interested in almost these slightly shamanistic rituals that we can perform to let ourselves off the hook. If I just eat the right food and I wear the right clothes and I, bike to work, then I'm kind of not part of the problem. And in fact, I think we need a level of, global societal change that isn't going to be affected by one's individual actions. And so what we really need to do is come together. And we need to get involved in movements, and we need to get involved in the political process, and we need to put pressure on industries. So there are some great examples of solutions around plastics. There are some really exciting companies that are trying to create a commodity out of social plastic, which is plastic that's been removed from either terrestrial areas where it's just garbage, or particularly from marine environments, and then it's being turned into new products and recycled into new products. And people are willing to pay a premium for this social plastic. And so there are companies even like Procter and Gamble that are buying social plastic and then marketing it. So there's some neat efforts out there. But I think, at the end of the day, we need collective action to address a lot of these problems.
Rachel Weiser asks, she says, as history has shown us, with declining civilizations due to environmental issues, it's difficult for individuals to give up the good life habits. So how do you think we address growing wealth, not only here, but then now in third world countries, and the overall challenge of consumption? We want to consume more and more and more.
Well, I think it's absolutely right that nobody is going to rally around a story of deprivation. Let's all deprive ourselves and lead a less good life to save the planet. That's not going to resonate with anybody. I think what's exciting about a lot of the solutions we're talking about is that they don't require deprivation. And so, if you're growing food dramatically more efficiently, it's still the same food. If your, Impossible Burger has sold 30 or 40 or 50 million burgers, I can't keep up, at Burger King, and you name the outlet all around the world, because they taste better, because people aren't buying them to save the planet. The Suez waste treatment facility in Santiago del Chile is turning all of the sewage from the biggest city in Chile into energy, clean water, and fertilizer. And they're not doing it to make the world a better place. They're doing it because they're making 25% profits. And so, across the world, we need innovations. What's driven the demise of coal hasn't really been, in part it's been focused on climate change, but a lot it's had to do with pricing and the fact that renewables have gotten so much less expensive and natural gas has gotten so much less expensive, which is its own problem. But in many instances, this isn't about going back to the Stone Age. It's not about self-deprivation. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing I would say is, yes, we want to be happy. But as I said earlier, we've been sold sort of a bill of goods about what makes us happy. So 24/7, it streams into our phones and our computers and our televisions that what makes us happy is acquiring more and more stuff. And that's just not what makes us happy. We know that from social science research. So what makes us happy is being with the people that we love and being connected to something that's bigger than us and taking care of the places that we love. And so if we went back to some of those things, it turns out we would be happier and we'd also be consuming less. So and we talk about that in the happiness chapter. So I totally agree that this isn't a story about deprivation, but it doesn't need to be for us to make progress on these issues.
Yeah, it's in some respects, I've heard people say it's unfortunate that back when Jimmy Carter was very concerned about solar power and such, he put on a sweater and turned down the thermostat
Exactly.
and set up this image that if we were going to do well by the planet, we would have to metaphorically wear some sort of a hair shirt.
Exactly.
Here's a question. What are the types of governance and economic policies, Sam, that you see are needed to bring about a healthier planet?
Well, there are lots of them, and we spend a couple of chapters talking about them. I think the first and most fundamental thing is that economics itself really isn't doing service to either our own health and happiness or planetary health. And so a sort of being a slave to GDP as a metric for what's meaningful in terms of economic growth is really problematic. And figuring out other ways to measure whether we're going the direction we want to go as a society is really important. And so there's a lot of interesting discussion about coming up with metrics that are better measures of our happiness and our state of happiness and connectedness and social capital. That's the first thing I would say. I think, in terms of governance, there's so many things, right? I mean, it depends which problem we're talking about, but, international agreements are going to be really important in this setting. And it's one of the things that's been really scary about the sort of rise of nationalism and the Trump administration's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords and from other kind of international governing bodies, because in many ways we're talking about managing global commons. And so we're going to need governance that does that. I think we're also, going to see it's a little bit carrot and stick. And it's why I say movement building is important, because I think when citizens really want to hold governments accountable and they want to hold their industries accountable, then the externalities associated with businesses start to change. And so, Impossible Burger suddenly can start to make a lot of money because people are viewing the externalities associated with the beef industry differently than they were before. And so they can start to push, industries in ways that they wouldn't have been pushed. And I think industries are starting to see that, carbon emissions, pollution emissions, impacts on biodiversity, chemical pollution are all externalities that are going to be increasingly expensive for them. And the more that we as citizens, hold their feet to that fire, the more quickly those business models will change. And so, it's sort of this combination of an activated citizenry, an enlightened government, an industry that's responding to those signals and leading the way. And I think we need to see all of those things happening.
Along these lines, Sam, what role do you think systemic racism has in our current dilemma with planetary health? And how might taking advantage of increased awareness of systemic racism help us increase planetary health?
Yeah, those are really, really important questions. I think that there are a couple of things to say. The first is that an overarching theme throughout planetary health is around equity and justice. And that, fundamentally, when you look at all the things that we do to change environmental conditions, there's usually a reason why we do them. There's a reason why we build dams, why we, build mines, why we cut down forests, why we fish the oceans. And usually those actions have winners and losers. And the winners tend to be the wealthy and connected, and the losers tend to be the poor and future generations, and particularly people of color and indigenous communities. And so when you start to look at the research, so we talked about my research on rising CO2, for example. We've written an environmental justice paper specifically about how the populations around the world that will be responsible for the CO2 emissions that will put people at risk for iron and zinc deficiency, the people who are emitting the carbon dioxide are categorically different from the people who will suffer the consequences in iron and zinc deficiency. And you can show that statistically. And so over and over, we see that it's the wealthiest, most connected people in the world that are putting the poor, people of color, indigenous communities, and future generations in harm's way. There's another element to this, though, which is one that I've been slow to really understand and been thinking about a lot, which is that I think that fundamentally the sort of dominant model, we were talking about the stories we tell ourselves, the sort of dominant model for how we live on Earth has been one of exploitation, one of concentration of power in the hands of a small group that becomes very wealthy and very powerful, and never mind the consequences, not only for nature, but also for all the people that don't have the power to fight back. And I think it's one of the reasons why movement building is so central to the response. And so a different model that's more about reciprocity and regeneration. It's not just regeneration of nature that we need, it's regeneration of how we relate to each other, across, color, across culture, and even across generations. That's going to be needed in order to move forward. And so I think they actually are intimately sort of interconnected.
We are starting to run out of time here, but we have a few more minutes. And there's a question from Betsy Zim. She asks, at a time when so many people live in urban settings and are removed from nature, how can they be expected to feel any connection to it or feel its value?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that lots of us worry about. I think the short answer is we need to design our urban settings differently. It's very possible to design urban settings to have a lot more nature in them. And there's a huge amount of research to show that creating neighborhoods with parks, creating green buildings, creating vertical gardens, creating green spaces on top of buildings, improves social connectedness. It brings us together in community. Having those places linked with bike paths improves air quality. It gives us more exercise. It reduces our reliance on cars and helps address climate. And so there are these huge benefits of designing our cities to include more green space. And I think one of those benefits, beyond the direct mental health benefit, is also a greater connection to nature.
We have a question from Greg who asks about the role of investing, trading, and economics. And how do we, and I think inside that question is, how do we address those people who tend to be at the very top, who tend to have the most influence and be the most connected? How can they be engaged in this?
Yeah. Well, it's a question I've been asking myself. I mean, there's a point at which you need to ask yourself whether the sort of investment and finance industries need to consider what are the ethical principles that guide their actions. And, there's certain things that would be considered beyond the pale. At one point it was investing in apartheid South Africa. Some investment houses won't invest in tobacco. Some won't invest in fossil fuels. But I think that more broadly, we need sort of planetary health investment principles, and that we should view a major investment in a big project to cut down a chunk of the Amazon to grow soybeans to feed pigs in China as just a fundamentally unethical thing to invest in. It's putting future generations in harm's way. And so, ultimately, I think that those industries need to sort of wake up. Often you see sustainability officers, but they're not necessarily thinking in these broad terms about how are we going to maintain and regenerate natural systems over time and protect the people who are in harm's way. And I think we need a set of ethical principles for finance and investment in that light.
We're getting towards the end of this, and the questions aren't getting easier, Sam. Sorry. Here's one about gender and children. How could we present this to our children? And also, the point is made that in all the exploitation we see around the world, someplace, I'm sure, in the very high 90%, these are processes and systems driven by men, and very often men of European descent. Just if you look in politics, I think there are very few historical dictatorships around the world that were run by women. Maybe Eva Peron qualifies. I'm trying to think of whom else. So, and yet children are our future, and I think women are slightly a numerical majority. What do we need to do to realign our relationship with women and children in our society, in our world society, so that we can have a healthier planet, or have planetary health, however we want to put it?
Well, I mean, of course, I mean, these questions are enormously sort of complicated in the sense that they touch almost everything. Of course, raising the status of women is important, sort of as, in its own right. It's also true that educating girls and providing economic opportunities for women is one of the most powerful things that we can do to reduce global fertility, and that reducing rates of population growth will take some of the pressure. It's certainly not a panacea, but takes a little bit of the pressure off some of the trajectories that we're looking at. There was a wonderful article about countries led by women in their response to the COVID pandemic recently. And, across the board, they were just way out ahead of the rest of the countries in the planet. And I have a hard time believing that's just a coincidence. So, I mean, I think that as girls and women become more empowered around the world, I can't see how it's anything but positive from the standpoint of planetary health. In terms of speaking with kids, which is sort of a different topic, when I think about, because I have two daughters, I think that there is actually, I mean, I get asked this all the time, both, college kids and high school kids. And what I try to emphasize is this is an unbelievably exciting time to be young. I mean, this is the great drama of the human species right now. Is sort of we've gotten on a trajectory, and we've been enormously successful at mobilizing all the resources in the planet to the point where we're now outstripping our planet's capacity to handle us, and we need to make a course correction. And it's going to take absolutely everybody's skills across every sector of activity, from sciences to government to law to the arts. And this is the great drama over the next 50 years. Can we do it? How do we alter our course? And how do we grasp that aspirational future that's right there for the taking, that could look as exciting as any time in human history if we can get these things right? So it's not a story of doom and gloom. It's a story of opportunity, but there's enormous urgency in seizing that opportunity. So I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be young, albeit a somewhat fraught time right now.
Yes, may we live in interesting times, I guess is the expression.
Exactly.
So we've come to time now, and I just want to thank you, Sam. Sam Myers is a physician and principal research scientist at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and co-editor of Planetary Health, Protecting Nature to Protect Ourselves. And once again, let me show the book here. And
You can go on the Living on Earth website for connection to this, the places you can get it, or for that matter, this discussion. And we would like to thank all of you for joining us today. And if you enjoyed this event, please feel free to donate to Living on Earth to help us produce more of this type of free content. You can just go to our website, which is loe.org, and click on donate at the top of the page. We're a listener-supported show, so any amount will help. And we also really, of course, would like to get your comments. And you can comment in this format. There are places that you can respond. There'll be a little survey that you may see afterwards, but also you can send us email at comments@loe.org. Again, Sam, thanks so much for taking the time, and congratulations for 2 years of hard work that I think people are going to use for many years going forward as a resource.
Thank you, Steve. It's a great pleasure to be with you. Really appreciate it.
Bye.